Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Jonathan Ferro, along with Lisa Abramowitz and Anne-Marie Hordern. Join us each day for insight from the best in markets, economics and geopolitics. From our global headquarters in New York City, we are live on Bloomberg Television weekday mornings from 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify or anywhere else you listen. And as always, on the Bloomberg Terminal and the Bloomberg Business app. Lisa Shalett of Morgan Stanley writing the following. Markets have been extremely active over the past month as traders have juiced up the already ebullient scenario baked into equity valuations, adding improved odds of a Republican sweep to the list of goodies already discounted. Lisa joins us now for more. Lisa, that's quite a quote. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Are you suggesting this market's gone a little bit too far? Are things stretched?
Absolutely. I mean, we've been talking about for a while that on a valuation basis, this is a very expensive market on very ambitious earnings expectations. Let's just take a step back and think about what companies have reported. All right, if you look at the 12-month trailing earnings for the quarter ended June 30th, year over year, S&P 500 profits, including the Mag 7, were growing at about 5% year over year. In the quarter, so far, what's been reported, and the Mag 7 haven't all reported yet, we're up 3%. The expectation for full year 2024 is we're going to get to a year-over-year compare up 9-10%, and then next year we're going to accelerate to 15%. So these are ambitious reacceleration numbers. And so, when we think about what's baked in and why we said there's a lot of goodies here, there's a view that we're going to get that reacceleration. It's going to be based on margin expansion, profit margins that are higher, but it's going to be so-called immaculate. We're not going to cut jobs to get there, which means, you've got to get productivity gains. And with all of this wonderful news happening, the Fed's going to keep cheerleading from the sides and cut, 25 bips a quarter at least. And then the latest is, all goes well. We get a red sweep in Washington. There is no more regulation. We get goodies like tax cuts.
No more taxes either, apparently.
And the world is a wonderful place. And so I guess, from where we sit, we just look at risk premiums. And so, as Lisa was just talking about the importance of this move in the Treasury markets, why are stocks shrugging it off? Right? I mean, typically this kind of move on the long end of the curve, particularly as underlying real rates approach 2%, which historically has been that obstacle for stock valuations, I think it's a bit dangerous for the stock market right here to be shrugging this off. This is a significant move. We've seen moves in the real rate, in inflation expectations, in term premiums, in auction performance, and so I'm very focused on watching these moves in the yields.
And the bond auctions, which is the reason why we will always welcome you on this show. So there's a question here about whether yields rising for the right reasons will actually be supportive to the equity market. And that's been an argument that a lot of people have made, and we've gone over quite a bit on this show. And there's a question of why you think that the yield rise that we're seeing right now is for the wrong reasons, or if it doesn't matter. It has breached that threshold where it needs to be something that stock investors start to pay attention to.
Look, I think that the bond market has this right. I do think real growth has been better. I am in the camp that says inflation expectations and the potential for an inflation boomerang next year is actually rising, especially if you bake in the part of the story about a red sweep. You don't get the red sweep with, all the goodies, but none of the collateral damage, which, as we know, tariffs and closed borders could be inflationary. I do think that the bond market is anchoring on, some hypotheses that's very anchored in the data. And I do think that the stock market is going to have to wake up and pay attention at some point.
So what do you do with that? I mean, do you just sort of go into gold and go into a bunker and hope for the best?
So what we're doing is we're really focusing on value and diversification. We're saying valuation in this market matters. So we're playing in the parts of the stock market that are somewhat cheaper, quite frankly. And so that has included some of the value cohort. It's included financials. It's included a handful of industrials, a handful of healthcare stocks. And that's really been our approach, is to say, let's even it out. Let's not take very big bets here and aim for some diversification.
Financials is a Trump bet. And yet you're saying it's actually a very different bet.
I thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, our preference for financials is not premised necessarily on some big deregulatory push. We think, that Basel II endgame easing of those capital requirements is going to happen regardless. We think that that's already, kind of been signaled by regulators. What has us excited about financials is not just the potential for cost cutting and operating leverage, but the capital markets activity really looks like it's going to come back over the next 2 years as, financial sponsors and the private equity guys finally get off the sidelines with these kind of market valuations and start transacting and doing deals.
Lisa, with the red sweep, you get the goodies along with some of the potentially the bad things that can hurt the financial markets. But what if it's not? What if the polling and the betting markets are underestimating the support Kamala Harris and some of these Democrats have with issues like abortion? How are you going to think about the next few years?
Yeah, so look, I think that there's, a Harris win at this point. I do think markets would be surprised. I do think we got somewhere between, a 2 and 5% pullback on that, because I do think that there's been, some pretty big rotation. But I think you get a lot of status quo type moves, right? I think we continue to get a continuation of the fiscal stimulus programs that we saw under the Biden administration, but we don't get necessarily, some of the issues and the inflation threats. So we continue maybe on this soft landing trajectory as opposed to this no landing trajectory. So I think the bond market comes back in as well.
But, so you think the bond market comes back in?
I think yields come back in.
Even
and that's
with all that fiscal spending?
Yeah, I do. Because her plans, if you actually, do the analysis, and our team has done it, fiscal deficits under her current plan are going to run about half what he's proposed so far.
So hard to game this out. If you think about 2016, and we always go back to this, Trump was bearish for markets.
Yeah.
Up until the night of the election, and then we woke up 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning, and all of a sudden it was bullish. We go to 2020, throw the scenarios out the window. We got the vaccine efficacy data in November of 2020. Everyone seems to have forgotten about that. It had nothing to do with the election at all. And markets, Lisa, absolutely ripped that month.
Yeah, so here's the question. How much is it the setup going in versus the actual candidate themselves? And this time around, and we've talked about this, if he can implement the tariffs, but he can't get rid of some of the regulations and the taxes unilaterally in the same speed, does that dissonance change the reaction function of markets?
Lisa, this was a clinic. It's good to see you. Appreciate it as always. Thank you for coming in. Lisa Shalett there of Morgan Stanley. John Lieber of Eurasia Group joins us now. John, let's just start with the Harris campaign, accusing the former president of being a fascist, drawing parallels with Nazi rallies of decades ago. When you look at the polls, when you look at where things are at, a week away from the election, is any of it landing?
No, doesn't seem like it. I mean, nothing's moved in this race except for one big event, which was Joe Biden dropping out. And otherwise, it's been pretty steady. You have seen some movements among subgroups, particularly independent voters, which were shifting towards Harris and now moving back towards Trump. But you look at kind of any of the big set pieces of the campaign, the DNC, the RNC, even Trump's assassination attempt, you weren't seeing big movements, and you're not really seeing them in the closing days. In fact, one of the big markers of this campaign has been how incredibly steady it is and how most people's views of both of these candidates are totally baked in.
John, I was thinking a lot about this last night, how a lot of this is culture wars kind of coming to the fore. It's the reason why we're seeing a massive gender gap. And on one side, you have the preeminence of cancel culture and sort of people who are really looking for potential issues. And then you have other people who say anything, and it doesn't really register. That's why I think it's notable. Has this incident at Madison Square Garden broken through in a way that some of these other comments really haven't?
Well, I think the risk is that it's a really close election, and you've got about 500,000 Hispanic voters in Pennsylvania, many of whom are from Puerto Rican origin. So it's entirely possible that it doesn't take a big movement in the polls or even a big event that's going to be the thing that decides this election. I mean, it would be extremely ironic if it were a unfunny joke from a no-name comedian at an unnecessary rally in Manhattan that ended up costing Trump this election. But an election where the two candidates are going to be separated by as few as 10 or 20,000 votes, that is completely plausible in this election cycle, which is why these Puerto Rico comments and then the other comments from the Manhattan rally are resonating so much and has Trump trying to do damage control.
John, what do you make, given how close this is, of the fires for the ballot boxes that we saw in Washington state? Some of the supposedly only 100 or a couple hundred different ballots were destroyed. But how much is there that risk going forward of this type of activity increasingly?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of risk of that. And you have to acknowledge that the Republicans have been convincing themselves for the last 4 years that the election was stolen. And in doing so, have basically studied some good techniques of how to try to steal an election. So I think that's a big factor. I mean, I don't think it's going to end up being a big factor here. But the thing that I think we should keep our eye on is people's trust in the system. So one of the problems with trying to tamper with the ballot box is you don't know whose ballots you're burning. So you can target different neighborhoods and have try to go after different demographic groups who you think have a higher propensity to vote one way or the other. I mean, Washington State is not going to vote for Trump. We know that. But I do think that this is going to be an issue where people lose faith in the process if they see that proper safeguards aren't in place to protect the sanctity of every single person's ballots. And that long-term has a really negative effect on people's belief in the fairness of the system. And it's how you get a majority of Republicans believing the last election was stolen. And I think that's a very dangerous and disturbing trend.
Washington State's not going to vote for Trump, but where this ballot box was, it's in a congressional district where the Democrat incumbent is facing a very tough challenge from Republican. Just when you look at the map, John, right now the Harris campaign thinks they can hold the blue wall. The Trump camp thinks they can at least take one of those states. When you look at Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which one is most ripe to flip?
I think, to me, it looks like Harris is the weakest in Michigan. She's got big problems with Arab American voters, and she's been a little bit weaker with white voters than she's been in other places. And so I think that's the place where the Trump team thinks they have probably the best opportunity. Pennsylvania is obviously the biggest and most important state and the one that is very, very close in the polls. Wisconsin seems like it's shaded a little bit towards Harris. So if I had to choose one, I would say Michigan is going to be the big battleground in this election.
It's interesting you chose Michigan because in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, those are the two Senate races that are now looking more like coin tosses when they were lean Democrat. Do you think those Senate races could go red, but the top of the ticket and those states go blue?
Yeah, again, I mean, it doesn't take much in this cycle for you don't need a lot of split ticket voters for something like that to happen. I think all three of those races are competitive. In Wisconsin, Baldwin, and in Pennsylvania, Casey has the benefit of being incumbents, and incumbency brings high name recognition, and that does help incumbents survive even very good challengers in a decent year for the out party.
Hey, John, good to get your thoughts, as always. John Lieber there of Eurasia Group. The Cook Political Report writing Trump's closing argument, his campaign says, is this: Harris broke it, Trump will fix it. And yet, even with all these advantages, the race remains locked in a dead heat. The reason for this, of course, is Trump himself. The Cook Political Report's Jessica Taylor joins us now for more. Jessica, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
It's good to see you in person.
Yeah.
There is this stat in your research, and I'm going to share it with our audience. There is no Trump policy that comes without his polarising behaviour, style and approach. In the September Cook Political Report Swing State Project poll, just 34% of voters said they liked Trump's policies and his leadership style. How much of a problem is that for the former president?
I mean, I think that if this were sort of a generic Republican, this race would probably be over. It's voters have to make a choice of, okay, you liked where the economy was under Trump, but you get all of the rest of this baggage that comes with him. So that's where we're seeing Harris's closing message. You know, he's he's an authoritarian, he's a fascist. This is the chaos trying to remind them of people. And I think some of the things that came out of that, Madison Square Garden rally, he's having to answer for them today. He's going to Pennsylvania, Allentown, where there is a large Puerto Rican Hispanic population. And that is now the story in this final week before the race. It's not focusing on, how he would be a change. He's trying to make it a focus on how he would be a change from a Biden-Harris administration. But Harris and Democrats are arguing, yes, but he was a change, and you're going to get all of this chaos. You're going to get all of this sort of insanity back again.
Jessica, are you seeing anything in the polls that Trump is going to be able to go past that ceiling that he's basically been capped at?
Yeah, this is the real question, and this is why, I think the polls, I think that's the thing at the back of our head, is that the polls were wrong in 2016, they were wrong in 2020, but they're still capturing about where he was at. They sort of this 47, 48%, and that's what we haven't seen. We really haven't seen him grow his coalition. So the question is, I think with these undecided voters, do they sort of go over to him? Do they stay home? Does Harris get them in her coalition? I think that's the real question as we're looking at some of this swing state polling that's just very deadlocked.
And Cook Political Report now has it as a toss-up race for presidential.
Yes, all of the 7 swing states we rate as toss-up, so it is as close as it can be. I mean, polls I continue to see out, private and public, all are within just 1 or 2 points, basically.
The financial markets, though, are pricing in a red sweep. Part of that has to do with the Senate map.
Yes.
And you've done some great work on actually senators that are defending seats, Democrats, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, but actually might be toss-ups. What does the map look like today?
The map is favoring Republicans, and that's why if we're looking at a Republican trifecta, that's more the most likely to flip has always been the Senate. That's because Democrats have a 51-49 majority, but we already know they're going to lose West Virginia. John Tester in Montana is the underdog, so that gets you to 51 for Republicans right then. Then the question is, as you mentioned, the races that we've seen tighten up in the past few weeks have been those blue wall states. Wisconsin, Ohio is the next probably with Sherrod Brown. That's still a very difficult state, and a state that Trump won by 8 points, but I'm seeing tightening polls in Wisconsin with Tammy Baldwin and Eric Hovde there. In Pennsylvania, that's the race that we moved last weekend to toss up with Bob Casey and David McCormick there. Michigan still remains closer. I would probably still rather be a slightly Alyssa Slotkin in that instance, but they're all very close. We've seen those races so I think as the presidential race goes, probably those Senate races go, because in 2016, every single Senate race went the same way as the presidential race. In 2020, only Susan Collins managed to win, even as Biden carried her state. So I think if we're seeing a delta of just a couple of points, I think we could see split tickets in Arizona, for instance, where Trump is favored there, but the Democrat Ruben Gallego is. So.
Well, can you just walk us through what a red wave looks like, what a red sweep looks like, given the fact that not all Republicans are the same, not all Democrats are the same?
Yeah.
How much are we looking at Trump truly having a clutch over the Republican Party in a way where he could get through his policies very easily, even with just a simple majority?
I think that's why you see Republicans that are wanting to get to, 53, 54 seats, because if it's just a very narrow 51, 49 majority, the most important people in the Senate become the moderates. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, who's up for re-election in 2026 if she runs again. They have such a favorable map. They want to take advantage of this, especially if you see Trump winning. And I think the House is very deadlocked. You only need 4 seats one way or the other. We see that as a toss-up. And, there's some places where in here in New York and in California that are more Democratic areas that Republicans need to run ahead of. But then we have seats in Michigan that are, I think, going to be very, very close as well. So, I think that probably as the way the presidency goes, probably the House goes as well. But that's why Republicans want to sort of get that bigger majority, gives President Trump a possible cushion.
When we talk about what's going to potentially change the outcome, everyone talks about turnout and potentially who has the better ground game, who has the better early voting game. What are you seeing on that front?
Democrats have a very sophisticated operation. That is sort of their bread and butter, getting those people out, knowing where to target them. And that I do hear some concern among Republicans because the Trump campaign has largely sort of farmed this out to Turning Point USA, to Elon Musk. But then we also are seeing some encouraging early voting signs in places like Nevada, where Democrats typically have a very strong ground game there. Republicans are having much better turnout. But I think it's a question of, have Republicans sort of learned to love early voting or encourage their people? So is this sort of cannibalizing their election day voting that we typically see as more Republican? Or is this indicative of just more Republican enthusiasm than Democratic enthusiasm? We sort of won't know until that election day turnout. But Republicans banking votes early, because in Nevada, for instance, we saw that Senate race decided by just a few hundred votes, that, if they'd sort of emphasized early voting early on, they might have won that Senate seat. And that could have been they would have had a much closer Senate this past
Trump
2 years.
gave a nod to this at the Garden, and you have seen the RNC do a lot more work to say early voting is safe, you should go out, vote early, just make sure you vote. Your best case in terms of when do you think this election will be decided?
I mean, I'm preparing. I think we can know the Senate pretty early on based on what happens in Montana and Ohio if we get those results. But I mean, I think Friday, Saturday, Pennsylvania is not going to be able to count some of their absentees. If it's a sort of a wave one way or the other, if we're seeing, North Carolina, Georgia go one way, Trump picks off one of those sort of blue wall states, we might see, I think, earlier results in a place like Wisconsin or Michigan, or if it goes Harris, but I think if it's very close, it may not be for several days, and I think we sort of need to steel ourselves for that possibility.
This is what a lot of market participants are focused on, how long it takes to get this result.
Well, the Maricopa County election officials, I keep going back to this because it dragged on in 2020. They're saying 10 to 13 days. Now, yes, they want you going into this with a low bar that potentially they could get out of this a little bit quicker, but 10 to 13 days. I mean, we're talking about weeks, not days.
And nobody wants a repeat of that mess, that's for sure. Jessica, it's good to see you. Thanks for dropping by. Thank you. Jessica Taylor there of The Cook Political Report.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in markets, economics and geopolitics. You can watch the show live on Bloomberg TV weekday mornings from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Eastern. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify or anywhere else you listen. And as always, on the Bloomberg Terminal and the Bloomberg Business app.